Welcome to Baby Jail Unlocked, the podcast where we peel back the layers of very common educational practices and ask what's really going on here. I'm your host, Dr. Chloe Keegan, and today we're diving into one of the most famous phrases in the early childhood world. Sharing is caring. We've all heard it, we've all probably said it, and in most preschool and primary school settings, it's as common as snack time and circle time. So, in today's episode, we will discuss what it actually means when we tell young children to share. Is it even developmentally appropriate? And what might be the unintended consequences of forcing children to give up their toys, their time, their personal space before they're ready? And here's where you come in. I would love to hear your thoughts and your stories on this topic, whether you're a parent, an educator, an academic, a policymaker, or someone with a vivid childhood memory that's really stuck with you on this area. You can share your insights to be featured in a future episode, or even get in touch if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast. This space is all about real conversations and your voice matters. So let's keep the discussion going. So the idea of sharing as a moral good is nothing new. It's deeply rooted in cultural and religious and social traditions. So it's rooted with stories about fairness and generosity and kindness and treating others the way we want to be treated. So, for example, you would have Sunday schools to Sesame Street. Sharing has been held up as the gold standard of good behavior. But when we bring this idea into early childhood development, things get a little bit more complicated. So let's start with the theory, not too heavy, but just enough to understand where this is coming from. So if we start with Piaget, children in the pre-operational stage, roughly ages 2 to 7, are developmentally egocentric. So the word egocentric doesn't necessarily mean they're selfish or mean-spirited. It simply means that children see the world primarily from their own perspective, that they haven't developed the cognitive ability to fully understand someone else's point of view. So, for example, if you take a 3-year-old and they're deeply immersed in playing with blocks, another child wants a turn and an adult steps in with, you need to share now, or you have to share. The child protests, maybe they cry or hold onto the blocks even tighter. And suddenly that child is labeled as difficult or not nice. But here's the thing, that's not bad behavior or negative behavior. It's developmentally appropriate because these children at 3 years of age engaging in this behavior, they're not being rude, they're being 3. So if we look at another theorist, say Vygotsky, who offered a different but equally important perspective, he argued that children learn social behaviors like sharing, not in isolation, but through interaction, say with their peers. Through, in his terms, scaffolding, as he calls it, adults guide and model and support learning. But here's where it gets interesting. So the phrase sharing is caring didn't come from child developmental theory. It comes from cultural shorthands. So essentially, it's a catchy message that sounds nice, teaches manners, and makes classroom management much easier, especially for adults. So it's a phrase we use because it fits neatly on posters and songs, but developmentally, it's a little bit of a mismatch. Because the truth is, most young children aren't ready to share, especially not all the time. And when we as adults ignore that, we're not teaching empathy when we enforce sharing. We are potentially teaching compliance. We're sending the message that children's feelings, their work, their boundaries aren't as important as being compliant. So where did sharing is caring come from then? It's not from child psychology or child development, but essentially it's coming from our adult ideals. So in the next section, let's look at what happens when those adult ideals clash with what children actually need. In busy classrooms, sharing can kind of become a survival strategy. So, for example, you have one truck, but you have 5 children. So you can see where this is going to go. There's only so much time, space, and stuff to go around, and educators and parents are juggling an awful lot. So encouraging children to share often feels like the quickest route to fairness, peace, and structure, and just a little bit of calm. Educators and parents usually promote sharing with good intentions. So it's framed as a way to support social and emotional development, reduce conflict, and teach children how to live in a community to be fair. So those are really important goals. But the thing is, sometimes sharing isn't about learning cooperation, it's about compliance, and how we teach children this is the difference between it being about cooperation or compliance. So when we as adults push sharing in a way that doesn't align with the child's readiness or their needs, it can become more about adult convenience rather than child-centered growth or development. So if we take again the example with the child with the blocks, and another child says, I want that, and the adult keeps reminding the child, remember, we need to share, that first child that has the blocks is going to feel very pressured. Now, whether that pressure is gentle or subtle or said in a nice way or demanded by the adult, either way, the child feels that pressure to hand the block over that they're using. And what have we taught that first child in that scenario? We haven't taught them empathy. We haven't taught them negotiation or problem solving. We've taught that child that having a feeling or having a need or having a toy, for example, isn't valid if someone else has a louder need for that toy or a louder expression of want or desire. So we've taught that enjoyment can be interrupted at any time by an adult because fairness means giving up what you have. And for some children, especially those, for example, who find transitions very hard or maybe use deep play as an emotional regulation strategy, that messaging about, well, I can take this from you because someone else wants it, that message can be very damaging. There's also the element of performance here. So children might learn to share not because they feel generous or because they want to, but because they've learned to please adults. They give a toy with a scowl or tears, or maybe they give it with a smile, and when they turn around, internally, they're devastated. And then the adult praises them anyway. Oh, that was so kind, or you're so good for sharing. That doesn't change the fact that that child internally is feeling unheard. Their resource, their need for deep play with that particular resource has been taken away from them when they weren't ready. So in that scenario, is this really kindness? And if it's kindness, it is costing children their agency. There's no space there for the child to assert themselves and say, but I want this toy for now. So we also have to acknowledge that not all children experience sharing in the same way. So some children might come from environments where resources are really scarce. Others may have experienced trauma where control over personal items is actually a source of safety or comfort. So for these children, forced sharing isn't just frustrating, but it can feel like an internal violation. And yet this idea of nice children share or children that share are so good, it's deeply embedded in our culture and it's rarely questioned. So here I'm looking to flip that script. So if we focus less on forced sharing and more on respecting turns, waiting, negotiating, and asking, what if we recognize that sometimes not sharing right now is an important boundary and it needs to be respected? So supporting children to develop through generosity means helping them experience ownership, understand other people's feelings, and learn how to give when they're ready, not when they're told. So if we look at this in a context, let me pull out a real life practice example to show how forcing sharing on children doesn't just create power struggles between children and adults, but it can actually infringe on children's rights with very harmful and upsetting consequences. So sharing is caring or an infringement on personal boundaries. Dylan was wearing the GoPro, and this method provided wonderful insight into the amount of concentration and precision demonstrated by Dylan in his ocean-themed small world play. However, as Dylan created a bigger scene on the table, Brendan, another peer, began to destructively interfere with Dylan's play, causing Dylan to become very frustrated, highlighted from below. Rebecca here is an educator, and there's another educator then that we'll identify later on in the story. So his educator says, "Oh, Dylan, can you please use your nice voice?" Dylan talks quieter now. "Stop stealing. Will you please stop stealing or I'll get angry?" Very, very articulate young boy. So his peer Brendan continues to steal Dylan's toys, and Dylan gets more upset but does not shout. So he's abiding by what he's being told, but still asserting his boundary. Dylan continues to repeat to Brendan, "Could you please stop stealing?" And he says it in this manner. Brendan laughs at Dylan as he takes another toy. Dylan takes the camera off in frustration and very calmly and slowly says to Brendan, "Would you please stop stealing?" Now, at this point, you can imagine Dylan is expressing this nearly through the grit of his teeth. So he is trying to abide by the educator's expectation, but still assert that he wants to play by himself. Dylan had invested a lot of time and energy in making his small world play, and the effort he made to communicate very calmly to Brendan to stop was inevitably clear. His shouting occurred after multiple attempts to stop Brendan, and Dylan was corrected by Rebecca, his educator, as a result. He then seeks out support from his other educator, Kim. Let's have a look. Dylan is seen in the background in the kitchen area, visibly upset. He has tears in his eyes and walks over to Kim, and he's very upset. They're messing it up. Kim turns to look at the kitchen area and says quite nonchalantly, "What's going on over there?" Dylan expresses, "They're messing up." They're messing up what, Dylan? And in this tone, she's very frustrated, almost coming from this whole, she's aware of Dylan's persona, potentially aware of Dylan's behavior, and potentially has her own stuff that she wants to focus on and doesn't want to manage this conflict right now. So Kim, in her response, is very frustrated. And Dylan continues to express, "They're messing up all of the animals." Kim says, again, very dismissive, "No, they're playing with them. Look, they're playing with the animals." Dylan, again, very articulately says, "No, I was." Kim then starts to emphasize, "You can play with them, okay? You have to share them." Kim turns back to the table and dismissively says, "Good boy," in response to Dylan. So in this scenario, as we can see, Dylan has clearly expressed himself multiple times and was only left with one option: to share. By forcing Dylan to share with a peer who was causing destruction to his play meant Dylan's voice went unheard by his educators. Lovely typo here, as you always like to see in your PhD. Ultimately, Dylan could not regulate himself to suit the needs of everyone else, including obeying the sharing rule demanded of him. So this is the consequence. This is what happens when children are essentially, as I'm going to say, they build resentment. So they build resentment when they're forced to engage in actions that doesn't align with their needs or wants, but in a way that they also feel like is unjust or unfair. So in the situation, Dylan feels like playing alone has been very clearly argued. His position is very clear. And for the educators now to be giving him conflicting feedback is causing him distress. But ultimately, because he's being forced to share when he's not ready, he's building up that resentment now in him, which we're going to have a look at now. So let's have a look. So Dylan emotionally breaks down. There is an extremely loud scream from the kitchen area, and a boy begins to scream and cry. Kim and Rebecca, the educators, look over, and Kim calls from her seat, "Dylan, what's wrong? Come here, come over to me." So the scream in the kitchen was coming from Dylan, just absolutely exacerbated with the fact that he was still having to share and just was not being heard. Dylan is on the floor crying. His educator, Kim, walks over to him and bends down to his level and says, to be fair, very calmly and understanding, "What's wrong?" Now, the issue here is, in the dynamic, it's very clear what is wrong with Dylan. And the fact that Kim is seeking him to explain himself more is going to build up further resentment and frustration in Dylan, who has multiple times expressed his need here. So she says, "What's wrong?" Dylan is crying and shouts, "I want to play by myself." Kim doesn't understand him verbally and asks for him to repeat it, saying, "What?" Dylan cried loudly again and says, "I want to play by myself." But Kim's response, again, is not listening to what he is very clearly expressing. No one can argue this, how clearly he is expressing himself. But Kim reinforces the rule that he has to share. Dylan, of course, begins to cry more. It's frustrated. He's resenting the fact that he's not being heard. And then Kim comforts him because he's crying. She holds him in his arms for a moment. but he moves away from her and faces another table. So then Kim walks back to the art table and talks to Rebecca. So essentially what happens here is Dylan dismisses Kim, and then Kim dismisses Dylan for dismissing her. So there's a lot of, as I note here, a lot of power is exercised in this dynamic that is important to note. Dylan was very clear in his need to play by himself, and he expressed this verbally to his educator. Rather than supporting this child who wanted to continue his small world play alone, keyword alone, the educator prioritized the rules of the classroom. Dylan had to share because he had to learn to share. That's essentially the rule. You have to share because you need to learn to share. The response to that, Kim looks to comfort Dylan, but Dylan resists and removes himself because not only has his voice been ignored, but he's been forced to share with a peer who does not have the same play intentions as he does. The dismissing of the child's voice by the educator creates a situation where Dylan is no longer upset, but it again starts to express this anger, resentment, frustration, and he ends up then taking this out on a peer. So Dylan, in this scenario, is standing behind Kim. He seems to be processing what's going on. And what I mean by that is he's standing, he's looking around, he's watching his peer play with his ocean setup that he has spent a lot of time in developing. And then what happens is he begins to talk to another educator, a work experience student. And Dylan interrupts angrily and says, "I want to snap them." And he's referring to a child's toy, the dinosaur, and pokes Kim gently with a dinosaur to get her attention. Kim is again dismissing him. She's potentially aware that he's frustrated that he's being made to share, but is not recognizing the long-term effect this is having on Dylan's emotions, i.e. he's more and more growing more and more resentful and angry. So Kim, again in her dismissive manner, says to Dylan, "Now Dylan, play nicely, please." Dylan then sits on a nearby chair, visibly angry, upset, holding 3 dinosaurs. Now, again, I really have to emphasize the idea that this is a moment in a whole world of moments. And we don't want to look at the educators in terms of good or bad. And we also don't want to look at the child as being good or bad. This is not the purpose of this example. The purpose is being able to look at how easily we can dismiss children when they so clearly voice what they need. And looking objectively, I can't see why anyone would say, no, you have to share, when Dylan's request to play alone didn't really make much of a difference to Brendan's play or other children's play. If anything, making or forcing Dylan to share forced a feeling of resentment and anger in him that was not productive for him, for his dynamic with his educators or with his peers. So what I would say is, was it worth forcing him to share? Would it have been better to support Dylan in expressing that, Brendan, you can play with this when I'm finished, for example? Maybe giving him the language to negotiate. Brendan, okay, you can have this, but I want to play with this. So by giving Brendan the language, he may have felt more in control of what he has to share, or being able to share personal boundaries and personal resources with other children, but not in this way. What I mean by that is, in this scenario, it is very much enforcing a blanketed rule on a child who is very clearly distressed and also very clearly expressing themselves. So what we want to look at now is, looking at this scenario and having gone through this together, we're now going to look at, well, how does this get positioned when we look at the children's rights specifically? And how can we be more aware in our interactions and dynamics with children in daily practices, whether in the classroom or at home? Now, when we talk about children's rights, we're not just talking in vague ideals. We're talking about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the UNCRC. The UNCRC is a legal framework that outlines the rights of every child everywhere. And yes, that includes the classroom, the playroom, and the playground. So there are a couple of key articles I want to highlight within this topic that are especially relevant when we talk about sharing. So we have Article 12, gives children the right to express their views freely in all matters that affect them, and to have those views taken seriously. You've Article 13, protects their right to freedom of expression in words, in actions, and in choices. Then you have Article 31, gives every child the right to rest and play and to engage in age-appropriate recreational activities. And then there's one that's not so widely spoken about for topics such as children's voice and expression. But Article 6 is quite important here because it supports the right to life, survival, and development, but at a pace and in a way that is right for the child. So when we enforce sharing, when children are not ready or are not willing to, what rights are we dismissing or ignoring? Right, so let's start from the start. We're not taking their views seriously. So that's Article 12. We're not supporting their right to express their needs or make decisions about their own play. That's Article 13. We might even be cutting short their opportunity for uninterrupted and meaningful play, which is Article 31. But also we're enforcing the pace in which they need to do something that may not align with them. So of course, this infringes on Article 6. Now, what we're doing often without realizing is during this enforced sharing, we're also prioritizing one child's desire or need over another child's right. That's not balance and it's not fair. Now, just before we get into it, this doesn't mean that the other child doesn't matter. Of course they do. But children's rights aren't about always getting what you want. They're about having your voice heard, your body respected, and your experiences valued. So when we model that kind of mutual respect by helping children and giving them the language to negotiate, by giving them the time to finish what they're doing, or by offering alternative solutions, we're doing more than just managing conflict. We're teaching consent. We're supporting agency. We're building foundations for lifelong social skills that come from within, not from being compliant. And that's the key point that we're going to emphasize here. So the next time sharing becomes an issue, let's pause. Let's think about what the UNCRC tells us. Children are not mini adults in the making. They're rights holders right now. So with that in mind, let's move into some practical tips for how we can navigate sharing in a way that respects children's rights and promotes authentic, respectful relationships. So now that we've looked at how forcing children to share can conflict with their rights under the UNCRC, let's figure out how we can support children's rights while balancing and supporting their social and emotional growth. So what do we need to do first? First, we need to shift the focus from enforcing sharing. So that mindset of sharing is caring, or children must learn to share, otherwise it may be detrimental to their well-being or their social skills. We need to remove that deficit mindset and reframe it towards supporting children's skills. Now, skills that I'm talking about are specifically turn-taking, negotiation, and empathy. So with these skills, the first thing you do is you start by teaching them the why, say, for example, behind taking turns. If we think about before asking a child to give something up or to hand it over to another child, talk to them first. So for example, oh, you're still using the truck and that's okay. When you're finished, Kate or Ben would like a turn. Can you let them know when you're ready? So this respects the child's right to make decisions about their play while still supporting their growing awareness of other people. You can also then model negotiation by offering language that they can use. So, for example, you could say, I'm still using it, but you can have it when I'm done. Or would you like to play together or do you want to take turns? Another helpful approach is to support children in noticing others' emotions, not by telling them how to feel, but by drawing gentle and subtle attention to what's happening in that moment. So, for example, can you see that Ben looks upset? I wonder if they're feeling left out. What do you think we should do? And this gives the child the opportunity to think for themselves and make a decision based on what they're viewing. And over time, this helps to build empathy and perspective taking without guilt or pressure from an adult. And then the last one is offer choices within boundaries. So for example, saying something like, you don't have to give it up right now, but your friend is waiting. Would you like to keep playing for a little bit longer and then pass it on? Or would you rather find something else to play with and you can play with that together? So that small act of choice supports autonomy and social growth. It says to the child, your voice matters, but so do the voices of others. And let's figure this out together. Now, they are very open-ended tips that can be practically used. But what's really important with these tips is you need to be just mindful and aware of your practice as it is now. Think of the times when you might go into automatic mode and say, no, you have to share. No, it's his. Maybe you'll do that and say it in your automatic manner. But in that moment, you now have the awareness to go, hang on a minute. How would I do that differently? And what language would I use? So it's about adapting these tips to your practice and to the children you're caring and working with, but also making sure that it's meaningful for you and for the children, and that in no way this is to add to stress to the job. If anything, as you practice this more and become more aware, this will become second nature. Now, the fun part for me, I would love to hear from you guys. So I have 3 questions that I would love to pose to you. And if you have any insight on these questions, I would love to hear. So the first one is, have you ever seen a child being made to share when they weren't ready? Or what do you do when 2 children want the same toy? What's your approach in practice? What kind of language do you use? And then the third question is, what works for you when helping children take turns? Let me know in the comments or share this episode with someone who may be doing these practices as well. Maybe they need some motivation, or maybe they need some advice. Maybe they just want something to listen to. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that the practices that we're engaging with are not stale and out of date, but that they're rooted in meaningful connection and respecting children's voices every single day. I want to thank you so much for listening to Baby Jail Unlocked, episode 1. As many of you know, this is a very new adventure for me and something I'm very passionate about. And I want to make sure that through this journey that I will be able to take on board more real lived experiences from listeners so that I can make this content much more rich and meaningful for everybody. So keep in touch, do stay tuned, and next week we will have another topic for you to delve into. See you then.